Using the correct altimeter setting is more than just a good SOP, it can be life-saving. Let's take a look at a real scenario.
39 Zulu, wind 080 at 10, visibility unrestricted, ceiling 2,700, overcast, temperature 20, dew point 15, altimeter 3003, landing and departing, runway 10, advise you have Charlie.
November 396 Delta Mike, San Juan approach, descend and maintain 2,300, altimeter setting 3033. Expect vectors RNAV runway 10. Note, heavy rain showers to the west, should not be a factor.
And 396 Delta Mike, we're descending to 2,300, got the new altimeter 3033, and the RNAV radar vectors RNAV 10. All right, descent approach checklist. Descent checklist complete, approach checklist, landing data set. Okay, glide path's coming in, 2,300. Speed is good. Approach checklist is complete. On tower 3205. Glide path is captured. We got 3 green landing flaps, sunning lights on. Minimums are set. Just approach altitude is 3,000. Okay, minimums are 410, coming out of 1,000 feet. Speed looks good, we're on glide path. Visibility is really bad. He said showers, but he said great weather, but sure not what they said it was. Okay, we're on speed, on glide path.
500.
500. And we are stable. Minimums. Airport's not in sight.
Too low. Terrain.
Terrain. Oh, good grief. 396 Delta Mike. 396 Delta Mike, we're going around. Wow, what the heck happened? Jeez. Okay.
This situation is much more than just a possibility. It almost resulted in a tragic loss of nearly 180 people. In May of 2022, an Airbus 320 descended to within 6 feet of the ground while in hard IMC conditions. And the worst part is, the crew never knew what happened until the airplane was on the ground later. The entire time, their altimeter and their vertical deviation indicator was showing a properly flown, centered RNAV approach. Similar to the situation David just recreated, the Airbus was flying an RNAV approach to LNAV VNAV minimums, with the vertical guidance provided by barometric VNAV. In contrast to an ILS or an RNAV approach flown to LPV minimums, on an LNAV VNAV approach with barometric VNAV, the vertical guidance on the final segment is coming entirely from the aircraft's altimeter. Any mistake in the displayed altitude will correlate to a mistake in the displayed vertical deviation. So in both the simulated situation David just flew and the actual situation the Airbus in France flew, even with a centered glide path indication, the aircraft was a consistent 300 feet too low for the entire final approach segment. So how did this happen? It's all because of an erroneous altimeter setting. The actual altimeter as received on the ATIS was 3003, but the approach controller incorrectly read David the altimeter of 3033, and he read it back without catching the large difference between the last altimeter setting he received. By setting the altimeter setting 0.3 of an inch too high, the aircraft flew the entire approach 300 feet lower than desired. This is exactly the situation that happened with the Airbus. An actual altimeter setting of 1001 hectopascals was read by the controller as 1011 hectopascals, roughly the same difference that David experienced in his video. What's even more frightening about this threat is you may have noticed the aircraft's Terrain Awareness and Warning System, or TAWS, did not provide any warnings to David until he'd already initiated the go-around and was within about 50 feet of the ground at that point. This is by design. The TAWS system ramps down sensitivity as the aircraft approaches the runway so that we don't get nuisance alerts very close to the airport. A consequence of this is you may not receive a TAWS warning at a dangerously low altitude in the last mile to mile and a half approaching the threshold. Flight Safety recreated this scenario for us in several citation simulators, and in every case a TAWS warning did not occur until the aircraft was within 30 to 60 feet of the ground. In response to the Airbus event of 2022, we at the CJP Safety and Education Foundation made some changes to the CJP SOPs, or Standard Operating Practices. When flying an approach with BARO VNAV guidance on final, the pilot should obtain and cross-check a minimum of 2 independent altimeter settings. Possible sources include the ATIS, AWOS, or ASOS, the altimeter setting as received from ATC, and a METAR received via SiriusXM, ADS-BN, or data link if the aircraft is equipped. You may have caught that the ATIS correctly reported the altimeter setting of 3003, while the approach controller incorrectly, and David read back, an altimeter setting of 3033. If flying an aircraft equipped with a radar altimeter, the pilot should check the radar altitude when approaching minimums against the charted height above touchdown zone at minimums. Understanding that variations in terrain and buildings can cause a slight difference in displayed RA, we're looking for gross differences from the expected height above the ground. Further, if the aircraft has the ability to set 2 different minimum alerts, for example on a Proline 21, consider setting one alert to radar altitude above TDZ and the other to the approach baromins. If the minimum calls don't happen more or less at the same time, something is amiss. So let's look at the when, where, and why of a BARO VNAV guided final approach. So first, why was David flying an approach with barometric VNAV guidance? Because of where he was. Flying the approach to San Juan, the aircraft is just outside the footprint of WAS coverage. To this point, a note on the approach plate says that WAS VNAV is not authorized on this approach. Vertical guidance must come from barometric VNAV. How do we know we are being provided guidance vertically from barometric VNAV on final? For a Garmin-powered flight deck, G1000NXI or G3000, the indication is right on the VDI. If we see a V at the top of the VDI and this home plate or 5-sided pentagon figure, we know that our guidance is coming from barometric VNAV, in contrast to a diamond with a G, which tells us that the guidance is coming from WAS. Let's see how this would look in a different avionics platform and see how we could use that information the radar altimeter provides.
.396 Delta Mike, descend and maintain 2,300. Expect vectors RNAV, runway 10. Current altimeter setting is 3033.
All right, 2,300 and 3033 Delta Mike. So this is our first chance to prevent the situation that David experienced from occurring. Hearing a new altimeter of 3033 and knowing that I'm going to be flying a BARO VNAV approach, our SOPs say we need to compare that with a second altimeter. So my options are XM weather, first of all. Unfortunately, since we are out of the lower 48, if I try to pull up a METAR for San Juan, that's not going to be an option. So in the absence of having a current METAR from XM or data link to the airplane be equipped, my only other option is from the ATIS. I've already received the ATIS and I heard the ATIS say the altimeter was 3033. This is our first and best chance to prevent this problem from occurring. I'm going to query the controller, and I'm going to ask him to confirm the altimeter setting. And if he reads 3033 again, I'm going to again say, okay, the ATIS is reporting 3003. Just want to make one more confirmation. Really don't want to just accept that such a huge difference in altimeter setting could have occurred in the 45 minutes since the ATIS came out. If we're in level flight and I misset the altimeter as David did, it's very obvious that setting it to 3033 makes the indicated altitude jump up by 300 feet. But as David experienced this in the descent, it was less obvious what had happened. But let's imagine that I don't catch this mistake. I'm going to bring the aircraft down to an indicated altitude of 2,300 feet, which will of course be actually 2,000 feet MSL. I'll set the co-pilot side to 3033 as well so we don't get that miscompare. And then let's look at how the glide path is going to present itself. Now, with the incorrect altimeter setting and the source of our VDI being barometric VNAV, when our VDI centers, and if we've armed the approach mode, when our glide path engages and actually tracks that VDI, we're going to be consistently 300 feet below the desired glide path. So here we are approaching the final approach fix. We're going to imagine that we did not catch the incorrect altimeter and have misset it to 3033 as occurred with David. But let's look at further SOPs that could help us prevent this situation from becoming unsafe. First, we have set our co-pilot's minimums to radar altitude of 398, which corresponds to the expected height above the ground at our DA. We have set altitude the pilot's minimums to the BARO 410 as our standard procedure. We would expect to then have these minimums calls occur at roughly the same time. Next, as we approach our final approach fix of REMSI, we see that we should be crossing on our glide path at 1,500 feet, knowing that we're flying in a coastal area where the ground is approximately sea level. We would also expect to see our radar altitude indicate 1,500 feet across REMSI. Understanding, of course, that variations in terrain under the aircraft won't make it indicate exactly 1,500, but if we notice a large discrepancy, that's cause for investigating further. So we're now coupled and flying a parallel flight path 300 feet too low because of our misset altimeter. Again, to us in the cockpit though, it looks like we are right on our glide path where we want to be. So, unlike in the Garmin flight decks where the VDI looks different on the PFD, the only way to know the source of our glide path information on a Collins equipped aircraft is to go into the index, arrival data page, where we will see that barometric VNAV is the source of our glide path. Contrast how this screen looks when we're flying an approach into an area such as Stuart, Florida that is in the WAS footprint. We see that our approach VNAV guide path information is coming from WAS, and we would be using LPV minimums. Approaching REMSI, we'll make our first check of our radar altimeter as we cross the fix. Coming directly across REMSI, we see our indicated altitude is 1,500 feet. Again, our indicated altitude is the problem, so it's not going to show us that something's wrong. But our radar altitude shows us 300 feet below that desired altitude. Again, giving us our first sign if we misset the altimeter that something is not right here. Our next check is going to be approaching minimums. As we approach our baro mins of 410, we would expect to see our radar altitude approaching 400 feet AGL. We have our simulator visuals set to good VFR conditions so that you could see what the flight path David was flying looked like. Of course, David was in hard IMC, as was the Airbus, so he wasn't aware of how close to the ground and how far from the runway he was until he broke out near minimums. Now, we're not expecting to hear a minimums call until 410 indicated altitude.
Minimums.
So the fact that we're hearing our minimums call well above what we expect to see for baro mins tells us that our radar altitude is much lower than we expect. That was our second potential catch by having the co-pilot's minimum set to radar. Our final check is as we approach our indicated minimums, we expect to see 400 feet on the radar altitude, but here we are not even at minimums and we're well below 200. This is our last check, and of course if we were visual, we can clearly see looking out the window that we are not in a good spot. Now you'll notice we're below 100 feet and we have yet to get a TAWS warning. In fact, we don't get a TAWS warning until approximately 30 feet radar altitude. If we weren't anticipating this situation, that would not be enough time for most pilots to react, perform a go-around without hitting the ground. So the TAWS is not going to be a viable line of defense in this type of situation.